Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this Friday evening, May 18th. A lot to get to this hour. First, of course, those Trayvon tapes. New information emerging today about the fatal moments surrounding the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. But do the new facts of the case really change what many believe here is going to be a trial that could go either way? And next, the sentencing of Daroon Ravi. It's scheduled for Monday. Ravi, as you know, charged with a hate crime following his former roommate's suicide. But the question is, does he deserve to serve time? And later, fracking. We're going to break down everything you need to know about this controversial energy extraction technique. We're going to hear from experts on both sides of the issue so that you can decide how you feel about it. And then nuclear power. We're going to hear from you at home about whether or not you think controversial nuclear power plant in our region ought to remain open. But let's begin with the Trayvon tapes. Our senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman, he's in first position with the very latest.
Well, Rich, with months having gone by and the public not privy to a lot of the information, Florida prosecutors have now dumped a mountain of evidence on the public. Hundreds of documents, audio and video recordings, statements, and photos. But even with all that, we may not be much closer to knowing exactly what happened. New information coming to light about the night of February 26 now that this new trove of evidence has been released. As a 7-Eleven camera recorded him buying Skittles and iced tea, Trayvon Martin's blood contained traces of THC. That's the active ingredient in marijuana. George Zimmerman, charged with second-degree murder, had been prescribed temazepam, used to treat anxiety or insomnia, as well as Adderall, a drug commonly used for treating attention deficit disorder. We now know a witness reported seeing a black male throwing punches, quote, MMA style, that Zimmerman walked away with a bloody scalp and a swollen nose, but what remains unclear is what started the brawl that ended with Trayvon Martin receiving a fatal point-blank gunshot to the chest.
You have still got to figure out who was the aggressor here.
We also don't know who's screaming for help in the background of a 911 call. The FBI says it's too garbled. The Martin family's lawyer says whoever it is doesn't change what George Zimmerman did that night.
He made a decision to get out of his car in the rain, profile, pursue, and confront Trayvon Martin and ultimately kill an unarmed teenager. And everything else is just window dressing.
But Zimmerman's attorney says the only thing that matters is a jury's decision.
One piece of evidence comes out, good for the state, things shift. Another piece of evidence comes out, good for the defense, things shift. Get all the evidence, get it presented in a way to the people who count, the jury.
With all those unanswered questions, one thing we do know is that the chief investigator in the case later called the shooting, quote, ultimately avoidable if Zimmerman had stayed in his car and waited for police. Rich?
And we also know, Andrew, that apparently there wasn't unanimity that night from law enforcement as to whether or not Trayvon, after the Trayvon Martin shooting, that Mr. Zimmerman should have gone home that night.
At least one investigator is on record now saying that he wanted Zimmerman charged that night.
Right, and I believe it was manslaughter, at least was from that snap judgment. As we know, nothing happened there. All right, let me bring in our table on this. We're joined by New York State Senator Greg Ball, also Dominic Carter, political journalist, author, William Dunlap, professor at Quinnipiac Law, where he teaches American constitutional law as well as criminal law, and of course, Andrew. And William, I'm going to start with you on this. Does the attorney that's really working right now with the family of Trayvon Martin, does he have it right that a lot of the facts that came out and whose voice was on the tape, who wasn't, it doesn't change the fact that Zimmerman called the cops that night. Cops told him, stick in your car, we got this. He chose to disregard it, and as he said, the attorney that was, he chose to profile, pursue, and then in the end, with his gun, regardless of who threw the punches, he pulled the trigger, and a kid died that was unarmed 100 yards from his front door. Is all the other stuff, as he said, window dressing?
Well, I think, as you said, it was probably a really big mistake for Zimmerman to leave the car, but that probably doesn't have anything to do with whether he's guilty of murder or manslaughter in this case. And I think the evidence that's just come out within the last day or two is going to make it almost impossible for the state to prove murder, and probably very difficult even to prove manslaughter.
Why?
First of all, there's evidence now, as I read it, that suggests this actually may have been self-defense. If it's true that he was on the ground and there was somebody wearing a hoodie on top of him banging his head into the ground, that raises the specter of self-defense If
But
the question
does it matter how that situation was created? Does it matter that a directive was given to avoid the situation from law enforcement? He disregarded the directive. He was the only one with a gun. He created the environment where either misunderstandings or whatever happened, we'll never know. But he created that environment. Is that irrelevant?
No, I don't think it's irrelevant at all. Generally speaking, people cannot start a fight and then use self-defense as an excuse for killing the person with whom he started the fight.
So why would manslaughter hold up then if he created the environment where fatality ensued?
Because if it got to the point where if he initially accosted Trayvon Martin and then Martin turned on him and started attacking him, under Florida law, if he had a reasonable belief that his life was in danger, a reasonable belief that the person attacking him, Trayvon Martin, intended to hurt him, possibly kill him, he does have a right at that point still to use self-defense. And one of the complicating matters, at least as far as people outside of Florida are concerned, is that Florida law creates a presumption that he had a reasonable belief that his life was in danger. And that's why he wasn't arrested in the first place. Self-defense is usually an affirmative defense that somebody will raise at trial and have to convince the jury, I had a reasonable belief.
And of course,
but in this case,
of course,
Florida,
Professor here talking about stand your ground here. Guys, let me go around real quickly. We're going to talk about the Ravi case in a minute right on the other side of the break. Put yourselves in the jury. We don't have all the facts, and I'm totally being premature here. That said, is there enough evidence here, you think, that Zimmerman, like that night, shouldn't walk free?
I'm not an attorney. It's one of my best attributes.
You could be a peer, but you got to start trouble. No, I'm saying you're supposed to get a jury of his peers, okay?
I mean, it would be nice if he had stayed in the car and if he had listened to that 911 operator. But at the end of the day, if that was the back of my head, I think that when we saw that, it would have been nice to actually see that photo maybe a day after when we heard when all this came out, so people would have had a little more balanced view. But the back of his head shows that he was fighting for his life, and so
but there was only one gun that night, and it was on Mr. Zimmerman, and he went over in the rain to the guy, Dominic. Again, I'm putting you in that jury with the facts that we know right now. Is there manslaughter in your eyes?
It's a tough question. What I can tell you is murder 2 is gone.
Yeah.
If I'm, you're putting me on the jury, it all depends. And what it depends on is how many African Americans are on that jury. Because African Americans have a different perspective, I was about to say of law enforcement, but this was not a law enforcement officer. I can also tell you that having covered these types of cases of alleged police brutality for 25 years, whenever you have a dead suspect of color and drugs, normally the person that's charged walks. Now, if I'm on the jury, I think I have a little more. I don't think a defense lawyer would put me on that jury.
Real quickly, Andrew, what do you say?
I think everything's so muddled now that I don't know how a jury is going to get to the bottom of everything. For me, the real tragedy is that by following the law and following procedure, everything got muddled that night. And I blame Stand Your Ground for that.
All right. We're going to take a quick break here. But before we do, I want you to sound off on the question that many of us are struggling with. Developments, yes, and these Trayvon tapes, as they're being referred to. Do you think it changes anything? Certainly, a few folks at this table believe it does. Please go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Richard French Live, and send us your opinion.